Tonight, we journey into the shadowed corridors of history to uncover a secret so carefully hidden, the Vatican didn't merely lock it away. They buried it beneath stone and scripture. Ancient Zoroastrian fire temples, their sacred flames travelling west across empires, tucked beneath churches, monasteries and cathedrals, surviving centuries in silence. Flames that witnessed truth, order and knowledge older than Christendom itself, now catalogued, sealed and forbidden to be seen. The traces remain in charred relics, sootless lamps and bronze braziers etched with forgotten symbols. And those who tried to follow the trail? They found locked vaults, vanished manuscripts, and whispers of a light that cannot be extinguished. The Vatican controls what history remembers, but the flames do not forget. They wait, patient and enduring, for the moment their secrets are finally uncovered. So before we step into the hidden fire beneath Europe, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. They say there is a room beneath the Vatican that no one speaks of, a place where light has never touched stone for more than 1,000 years. Deep below the marble halls and golden ceilings, behind layers of sealed corridors and forgotten staircases, there are vaults that contain things the public was never meant to see. Among them, according to a rumour that refuses to die, lies a report describing something impossible, a flame that still burns, alive, ancient, and untouched by time. Not a candle, not a relic, but a fire that traces its origin back to the temples of Persia, to the sacred altars of Zoroastrianism, a religion older than Christianity itself. The Vatican calls it myth, yet their silence only deepens the mystery. What if that fire was never extinguished? What if beneath Rome, the heart of Christendom, the eternal flame of another god still burns? The story begins with a whisper that first appeared in a letter dated in the year 1648. A Jesuit scholar, writing to his superior in Rome, described a strange discovery under an abandoned basilica near Naples. The letter spoke of a chamber sealed with lead, where a fire burned without smoke or ash. The priests who opened it fled in fear, believing they had found the work of demons, but one line stood out. The fire, he wrote, spoke of order, not destruction. The report was archived, classified, and buried beneath centuries of Vatican record-keeping. Yet, copies survived, passed quietly among scholars who understood its meaning. The flame was not demonic. It was Zoroastrian, the oldest religion to treat fire as a living symbol of truth. According to ancient Persian belief, sacred fire is not worshipped, but honoured as the purest expression of light, a bridge between the divine and the human world. It was tended day and night by priests called Magi, who saw in its glow the reflection of Ahura Mazda, the creator of all that is good. When the Persian Empire fell, many of these temples were destroyed. Others were hidden, their flames carried westward by fleeing priests. Some say they reached as far as Greece, others whisper they crossed into Italy, long before the rise of the Church. Imagine what it would mean if that rumour were true. If the foundation of the Vatican itself stood upon the ruins of a fire temple, its light extinguished not by time, but by decree. Throughout history, religions have borrowed from one another, sometimes blending, sometimes erasing. But fire, unlike doctrine, cannot be rewritten. It burns through lies. It remembers. Perhaps that is why the Vatican would hide such a discovery. A living flame that predates their own faith, untouched, uncorrupted, would raise too many questions. About origins, about truth, about who really carried the first light of God. And so the rumour lingers, flickering quietly in the dark corners of history, waiting for air. Beneath Rome, in silence, a flame still breathes. Long before Europe fell into the fog of the so-called Dark Ages, before cathedrals rose and empires collapsed, a different kind of light guided civilization. It was not the light of conquest or invention, but the steady flame of a belief that order, truth, and goodness were living forces. That belief was Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest known religions on earth. born in ancient Persia around 3,000 years ago. While Europe would later stumble through centuries of confusion and superstition, Persia was building a civilization on the idea that truth itself was sacred and that the purest symbol of that truth was fire. In the heart of every Zoroastrian temple burned an eternal flame, tended day and night by priests who saw in its glow not a god to be worshipped, but the visible breath of creation. To them, fire was not a weapon of punishment, but a mirror of divine order. The flame represented Asha, the eternal law of truth, harmony, and right action that governs all things. And above it all was Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, the source of wisdom and goodness in the universe. According to Zoroaster, the prophet who first heard this truth, the world was a battlefield between Asha, the force of order, and Druj, the force of deceit. Every human thought and action tilted the balance one way or the other. It was not sin that doomed a soul, but falsehood. It was not faith that saved one, but living in alignment with truth. In this vision, even gods were judged by their honesty. It was a world built not on fear of divine wrath, but on personal responsibility for the state of creation. To the Persians, maintaining the sacred fire was an act of remembrance. It linked the living to the unseen. The temple flame was said to burn with knowledge of the past, its light holding memories too ancient for books to contain. The priests who guarded it did not simply protect fire, they protected history itself. In their eyes, flame was consciousness, an incorruptible witness to all human deeds. When the wind of empire spread across continents, it carried this reverence with it. Even Greek philosophers, Roman scholars, and later mystics would echo fragments of Zoroaster's words, but as Europe later slipped into the shadows of ignorance and control, much of this knowledge was buried, recast as heresy, or forgotten. The idea that fire could be pure, intelligent, and divine did not fit the new order that sought to monopolize light. Yet something of it survived, hidden beneath rituals, candles, and incense. The fire still burns, but few remember where its meaning came from. The Zoroastrians called their sacred flame Atar, the energy that connects the material and spiritual worlds. It is said that as long as one true fire remains, truth cannot die. And perhaps, somewhere beneath stone and silence, that first flame still waits, watching, remembering the time when light was not feared but understood. In the spring of 1592, inside the private study of the Vatican Library, a cartographer named Lorenzo Valli was cataloguing a collection of maps recently acquired from Venice. Among them was a worn leather-bound atlas with faded ink and the scent of sea salt clinging to its pages. Most of its drawings looked familiar. Coastlines and trade routes stretching across the Mediterranean. But near the back, Lorenzo found something that made his hands tremble. Across regions of Europe and Asia were small red markings labelled in both Latin and a strange script he did not recognize. The words read Atar, followed by phrases written in Middle Persian. He had seen enough ancient manuscripts to know what Atar meant. It was the sacred fire of the Zoroastrians. Yet here it was, marked not only in Persia, but in Greece, Italy, even Gaul. Sites where, according to history, no Zoroastrian temples should have ever existed. In the margin, written in neat Vatican Latin, was a single phrase, non publicandum, not to be made public. The atlas was quietly locked away, and for centuries it remained hidden from view, mentioned only in the inventory lists of papal librarians. What was so dangerous about a few old symbols on a map? Perhaps because those symbols suggested a truth that would upend the accepted history of religion. If the markings were accurate, they meant that Zoroastrian fire temples once stood far beyond Persia, scattered across the ancient world, including the lands that would later form the Christian heart of Europe. That would mean the sacred flame was not a local belief, but a global one, predating and possibly influencing the rituals that later defined Western faith. Historians often speak of the Renaissance as an age of rediscovery, yet what they rarely mention is how much was found and immediately hidden again. For every masterpiece painted, there were manuscripts sealed, artifacts suppressed, discoveries erased from public memory. The Vatican's archives were not just a library. They were a filter, a gate between what humanity was allowed to know and what it was not ready to see. The red marks on that map were more than locations. They were coordinates of forgotten light, traces of fire altars buried beneath churches, beneath cathedrals, perhaps even beneath the Vatican itself. Imagine what it would mean if these sacred sites were unearthed. It would reveal that the lineage of fire worship, of light as divine truth, flowed directly into Christianity's earliest symbolism. The candles, the lamps, the eternal flames of the saints might not be original at all. They could be echoes of Attar, renamed and disguised. Perhaps this is why the papal librarian chose silence over disclosure. For those who rule by light, discovering a greater light predating their own is the deepest threat of all. Somewhere, still catalogued under restricted access, that atlas waits. A silent witness to a world where sacred fire once illuminated lands now claimed by the shadow of secrecy. In the autumn of 1673, a Jesuit courier named Father Matteo Ricci arrived in Rome, carrying a sealed report bound in black leather. It was marked confidential and addressed only to the office of the Vatican's Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. Inside were a series of pages describing something that should not have existed. A subterranean shrine beneath a monastery in Sicily where a flame burned without fuel, without smoke, and without sound. The Jesuit who had discovered it described it as a light that neither wind nor water could quench. The monastery, built on the ruins of an ancient site near Mount Etna, was said to sit above catacombs too deep for ordinary excavation. The report detailed how a group of monks had uncovered a narrow stairway sealed behind a wall while restoring the chapel floor. When they descended, they found a small circular chamber carved entirely out of volcanic stone. In its centre stood a bronze bowl resting on 3 serpent-shaped legs, and inside that bowl burned a flame that moved like liquid gold. No smoke rose from it, no heat could be felt. One of the monks tried to pour water over it, but the flame hissed and glowed brighter, as if alive. Fearing they had found a pagan relic, the monks reported the discovery to their superior, who in turn contacted the local Jesuit order. Father Ricci was assigned to document everything. His report described ancient inscriptions etched into the walls, written in a language none of them could read, and strange geometric symbols that matched those seen in Persian fire temples. He wrote that the flame gave off a faint vibration, like the hum of a distant choir, and that standing too close to it caused the heart to race and the mind to clear. The monks were terrified, yet unable to look away. The following week, the chamber was sealed again by order of the Vatican envoy who visited the site. Officially, the reason given was safety. Privately, Ricci noted that the envoy had taken a small vial of ash from the base of the brazier and carried it away under guard. After that, the records fell silent. No mention of the flame appeared again in Jesuit correspondence. Centuries later, a researcher sifting through archived Vatican documents found a reference code linked to Ricci's report, but the file itself was missing. Only one page remained, listing the site coordinates, its classification level, and a Latin phrase meaning to be held in perpetual discretion. Local legends in that Sicilian region still tell of ghost lights seen beneath the monastery during storms, flickers of gold glowing through cracks in the stone. Perhaps the Jesuit courier found more than a relic. Perhaps he stumbled upon a fragment of the ancient world, still burning quietly under the feet of a modern faith, waiting for someone brave enough to unseal it once more. Every Christmas, the story is told the same way. 3 wise men from the east, following a star to Bethlehem, carrying gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But the truth behind the Magi is far older and far stranger than most realize. They were not kings, not travelers, and not simple astrologers. They were Zoroastrian priests, guardians of the sacred fire and keepers of the first system of celestial science. Long before the birth of Christ, they had charted the movements of the planets and stars with precision that astonished even Greek scholars. Their temples, crowned with open flames, were aligned with constellations rather than crosses. To them, the heavens were not symbols of fate, but reflections of divine order. When Rome later adopted Christianity, it also unknowingly inherited fragments of their wisdom. The Church would speak of divine light, but it was the Magi who had first taught that light was the physical expression of truth itself. In ancient Persia, the Magi were trained from childhood to live in perfect ritual purity. They studied the cycles of stars to determine when sacred ceremonies should be performed, believing that cosmic timing was a language spoken by the universe itself. To them, every fire lit on earth was connected to the fire of creation in the sky. The moment they saw a new star appear in the constellation of Virgo, they knew something extraordinary had occurred. To the Magi, that celestial event was not a prophecy, but a signal, a sign that divine wisdom had manifested in human form. When they arrived in Bethlehem, they were not simply offering gifts. They were acknowledging recognition, fire meeting fire, light meeting light. Yet the Church, centuries later, reduced them to a symbolic trio of travellers. Their sacred identity was quietly erased. The idea that priests from a foreign faith had played a part in the origin story of Christianity was too uncomfortable to preserve. But traces of their influence remain hidden in plain sight. The use of incense during Mass, the lighting of candles during prayer, the observance of purity before ritual, all echo Zoroastrian traditions. Even the image of the halo, the glowing crown of light around saints and angels, may have originated from the fire crowns worn by Magi during sacred ceremonies. In time, Rome absorbed these symbols, reshaped them, and called them its own. But history remembers. Beneath the gilded ceilings of cathedrals and the flicker of votive flames, an older language still speaks. The language of stars, of fire, of balance between light and shadow. When Rome met the Magi, it inherited not only their reverence for divine light, but also their secret. That truth and purity were forces stronger than any empire. The Church could erase their names from Scripture, but it could never fully extinguish their flame. Somewhere in every candle lit in worship, the echo of the Magi still burns, a reminder that the first light to guide humanity was never bound to one faith, but to the stars themselves. In the quiet ruins of ancient churches scattered across Europe, archaeologists have found something that does not fit. Beneath the marble fonts where generations were baptized, there are older stones, darker, smoother, and arranged in circular basins that predate Christianity by centuries. These structures have been unearthed in Gaul, in the highlands of Iberia, and deep within the Balkans. The official reports call them reused foundations, yet their shape and alignment suggest something far older and far more deliberate. These were not built to hold water, they were built to hold fire. In the earliest centuries of the Christian era, when the new faith spread across the collapsing remnants of Rome, its missionaries often built their churches upon the ruins of older temples. It was a symbolic act of conquest. But in doing so, they also inherited the sacred architecture of the world they sought to erase. Many of these foundations once belonged to Zoroastrian fire altars, or their local variations that had spread through ancient trade and migration. Their circular form, their polished interiors, even the traces of soot baked into the stone, all point to rituals of flame, not baptism. When priests later converted these altars into fonts, they did not always destroy what came before. Instead, they covered it, layered stone upon stone, transforming the basin of fire into a pool of holy water. To the eyes of history, it appeared as a new beginning, but to the stones themselves, it was only a change of element. The fire had been smothered, not forgotten. In one church in southern France, Ground scans revealed a hollow cavity beneath the baptismal font that still carried signs of intense heat. In Spain, a set of inscriptions found under a cathedral floor bore fragments of ancient Persian symbols alongside early Christian crosses, as if two worlds had been pressed together and fused. And in a monastery in Serbia, archaeologists uncovered a buried chamber whose walls were coated with a thin black residue. When analysed, the residue contained traces of oils and resins once used in fire offerings. None of these findings are mentioned in popular histories, but together they tell a silent story. Christianity did not erase the worship of fire, it absorbed it. The symbolism of water washing away sin replaced the fire that purified through truth. Yet, even now, the echo remains. Every baptism begins with the lighting of a candle. Every church keeps a flame burning near the altar. It is as if the memory of fire still lingers beneath the surface, whispering through stone. The builders of the new world stood upon the ashes of the old, but the old world still breathes beneath their feet. Fire and water, truth and faith, two elements forever bound in the same sacred vessel. And if you listen closely in those ancient halls, you can almost hear it, the faint crackle of the flame that once burned where holy water now rests. In the year 1923, a memorandum was filed inside the archives of the Vatican Museum under a simple catalogue number. It described the results of a chemical analysis on a small vial of ash taken from a confiscated altar found in a remote monastery in northern Italy. The memo was signed by a scholar named Dr. Enrico Salvi, a chemist and historian known for his quiet loyalty to the church. What he discovered in that vial, however, would never appear in any public record again. The ash was unlike anything found in typical Christian ritual. It contained traces of aromatic resins that had once been imported from Persia, fragments of rare metals, used not for decoration but for purification, and microscopic particles of burned copper and silver. These elements match descriptions found in ancient Zoroastrian texts, detailing the mixture used in their sacred fires. The resins symbolized creation, the metals represented truth, and together they produced a flame meant to purify both body and spirit. Salvi's analysis confirmed that the altar from which the sample had been taken did not belong to the Christian era at all. It predated it by many centuries. The stone structure had likely been an Atash Bayram, one of the highest order fire temples in Zoroastrian tradition. When the monastery was built over it in the early medieval period, the altar was not destroyed. It was sealed. The monks who later discovered it had mistaken it for a pagan relic and turned it over to the Vatican for study. Salvi's memorandum described his astonishment in careful, cautious words. He noted that the ash's chemical composition could only have come from a continuous, high-temperature burn sustained for decades, perhaps centuries, using substances known only to ancient Persian priesthoods. He ended his report with a question. How did an altar of fire from Persia find its way beneath an Italian monastery? That question was never answered. Within weeks, the memorandum disappeared from circulation. The only trace left behind was its catalogue number on an inventory list. Decades later, a researcher searching for early Christian relics stumbled upon that same entry and requested access. The response came back marked restricted by order of the Secretariat. No explanation was given. Since then, the vial itself has never been found. Some whisper that it was moved to the Vatican's secret archive, while others claim it was destroyed to prevent questions from spreading. But what cannot be erased is the meaning behind that ash. In Zoroastrian belief, Asha means truth, the law that governs all existence. To burn in its name was to purify the world of deceit. The ash of Asha was the residue of creation itself, the dust of what once was pure. Perhaps that is why it had to vanish. Because within those grains of grey lay proof that long before the Church claimed to hold the light, another civilization had already mastered it, and the remains of that light still rest quietly beneath the hands that tried to bury it. Time is one of the quietest forms of power. Whoever decides how days are counted also decides when people pray, when they work, and when they believe the world began. Long before the church built its calendar, the Zoroastrians had already measured time by the movement of the sun and the rhythm of the stars. Their system was breathtaking in its precision. It divided the year into 12 solar months, each aligned with a constellation, each tied to a sacred principle of creation. Their festivals were synchronized with solstices and equinoxes, moments when the universe itself seemed to pause between light and darkness. For them, time was not just a number. It was a living cycle that mirrored the struggle between truth and falsehood, order and chaos. When Christianity began to rise across the ancient world, this older solar system of belief became a threat. The Church built its liturgical year not on celestial precision, but on symbolic rhythm. Easter, Christmas, and Lent followed theological timing, not astronomical alignment. But among the early converts were scholars and astrologers who noticed the differences. They saw how Zoroastrian festivals like Nowruz, the Persian New Year, matched perfectly with the spring equinox. They knew that the Magi who once followed the Star of Bethlehem came from a culture that could predict celestial events with astonishing accuracy. To acknowledge this would mean admitting that the Church's own sacred calendar was not original, but derived from an older cosmic science. By the 4th century, church councils began enforcing the use of their own calendar. Dates were fixed by decree, not by the stars. The festival of Easter was separated from the Jewish Passover and the Persian equinox to distinguish it from older traditions. It was not just a matter of faith, but of authority. If people celebrated by the stars, they might start listening to the heavens instead of the pulpit. In the centuries that followed, the Church grew increasingly obsessed with controlling time itself. The Julian calendar was declared official, but its calculations drifted slightly each year, causing feast days to lose their celestial alignment. When the error became too obvious to ignore, Pope Gregory XIII reformed the system in 1582, creating the Gregorian calendar still used today. The reform was presented as science, yet its deeper purpose was control. The stars no longer ruled the calendar, the Vatican did. The Zoroastrian priests had once taught that time was sacred because it could not be owned. It flowed from the cosmic fire, eternal and self-correcting. To them, every sunrise was proof that truth could never be delayed. The Church feared that power. A world guided by the stars needed no human intermediaries. And so they rewrote the clock, turned celestial cycles into man-made seasons, and called it divine order. But the sky never forgot. Even now, when the sun stands still on the solstice, or the moon eclipses in perfect silence, it whispers the old rhythm of the world, the one measured not by decree but by light. In ancient Persia, fire was more than light. It was truth made visible. The Zoroastrians believed that when a person stood before the sacred flame, they stood before an unblinking mirror that could not lie. It was said that the fire could reveal purity of heart, that it could sense deceit and expose the unclean spirit of falsehood. In their rituals, the priests of fire, known as the Magi, would invite seekers to approach the flame in silence. If the flame burned steady, it meant their heart was aligned with Asha, the divine order of truth. If it flickered or dimmed, it meant something within them was out of balance. It was not magic. It was morality made manifest. Fire, to the Zoroastrians, was the living conscience of the world. It did not punish, it revealed. When the faith of Persia faded and Christianity spread across Europe, this understanding of fire did not vanish. It changed form. The church that rose upon the ashes of ancient knowledge learned to wield the same symbolism, though stripped of its original meaning. By the 12th century, fire had become the instrument of judgment, not reflection. Inquisitors used it to punish those deemed impure, heretics, healers, and thinkers who dared to question. They called it purification by flame. yet there was nothing pure about it. What once was meant to reveal the truth became a weapon to silence it. Trials by fire, where the accused were forced to walk over hot iron or hold burning coals, were justified as divine tests. If their wounds healed clean, it was said God had proven their innocence. Few realized that this twisted ritual was a dark echo of Zoroastrian ceremonies, where fire once stood as the impartial judge of conscience, not as the executioner of faith. Somewhere in the hidden writings of medieval clerics, fragments of that older wisdom still surface. In one Inquisition manual dated 1326, a note reads, "Fire does not destroy the pure, it only consumes the lie." Those words are nearly identical to a verse from the Avesta, the Zoroastrian holy text. It seems that even the men who carried out the burnings knew, perhaps dimly, the source of their own power. They had taken the fire of truth and turned it into fear. The irony is haunting. The flame that once reflected the inner light of humanity became the same flame used to erase it. Yet fire remembers. In its nature, it still judges as it always did. It shows what cannot be hidden. When we stare into fire, whether in a hearth, a candle, or the sun, there is a part of us that feels it. The ancient pull, the awareness that it knows us, that it sees without words. The Zoroastrians believed that at the end of time, all souls would pass through a river of molten flame, and only the truthful would walk unharmed. Perhaps that day has already come, not as prophecy, but as reminder, for in every age, the flame still waits to judge, not through pain, but through reflection. In the heart of Europe, beneath the shadows of Gothic cathedrals, there lies a hidden language carved in stone. It is not Latin, nor Greek, but a code of geometry that whispers of origins far to the east. On the inner walls of cathedrals in France, Germany, and England, stonemasons left small, deliberate marks. Some resemble simple letters or symbols, others are intricate patterns, spirals, and stars. To most, they are merely signatures of anonymous builders, but when studied closely, something extraordinary emerges. Many of these symbols match those found in ancient Persian ruins, specifically from the Achaemenid and Sasanian empires. The same ratios that guided the columns of Persepolis and the arches of Ctesiphon appear centuries later in the blueprints of Chartres, Notre Dame, and Cologne. It is as if the masons of the Gothic world inherited a technical grammar that had travelled silently across time and empires. Scholars call it coincidence, yet geometry leaves little room for chance. The golden ratios, the proportions of light and shadow, the spiral patterns aligning with celestial points, all reveal a precision that speaks of a lineage too consistent to ignore. How could such knowledge have survived the collapse of the ancient world? The answer may lie with the guilds of builders who wandered from east to west, carrying not books, but memory. Long before universities were founded, there existed a network of craftsmen, architects, and engineers bound by secrecy. They spoke a universal language of stone. Many early Gothic masons called themselves Children of the Light, a title echoing the Persian builders who worked under the doctrine of Asha, divine truth and order. Their goal was not merely to construct buildings, but to shape matter into harmony. In Persia, geometry was sacred. Every measurement mirrored the perfection of creation. When these patterns resurfaced in medieval Europe, they did not come as innovation, but as rebirth. The flying buttresses, the ribbed vaults, the pointed arches that defined the Gothic style were not random inventions. Their mathematical precision mirrored Sasanian designs used in fire temples and royal halls long before Christianity spread westward. Even the symbol of the rose window, a circle divided by 12 spokes, mirrors the Zoroastrian solar diagrams representing the 12 aspects of creation. It is said that the early builders of cathedrals saw themselves as keepers of light. They used geometry to channel sunlight into divine expression, transforming stone into spirit. Perhaps without knowing it, they were continuing a mission begun in the East, to build structures that reflected cosmic order on Earth. Somewhere along the line, the Church claimed ownership of their work, turning spiritual science into religious monument. But the stones still remember. When sunlight passes through a rose window and lands perfectly along a line drawn centuries ago, it is not just engineering. It is a whisper from Persia, a reminder that light, geometry, and faith once spoke the same language long before empires built walls between them. In the year 1889, a group of archaeologists working near the Caspian coast unearthed a set of clay jars sealed with pitch and buried deep beneath the ruins of an old Zoroastrian temple in Tabaristan, a province once known for its fierce resistance to foreign conquest. Inside the jars were several fragments of parchment written in Pahlavi script, the ancient language of Persia. At first, the letters appeared to be simple records of temple life, but when they were translated years later by a scholar named Henri Delaunay, they revealed something far more compelling. They were letters written by priests fleeing westward during the 7th century, when Islamic forces swept through Persia. These priests described carrying with them the unending fire, a sacred flame said to have burned continuously since the reign of the first kings. The letters spoke of their journey across deserts and mountains, guided by starlight and secrecy, protecting the flame in a bronze vessel wrapped in linen, soaked with resin to keep it alive. They wrote of small villages that welcomed them, and of others that feared them, mistaking their flame for witchcraft. The final letters end abruptly, but one fragment mentions reaching the shores of a great western sea and finding refuge among people who worship one God and know the symbol of light. That phrase has haunted historians ever since. Some believe the priests found shelter among early Christian communities, perhaps monastic orders that later integrated parts of their knowledge into local traditions. It would explain the sudden appearance of fire rituals in certain early churches, the lighting of perpetual lamps, and the practice of keeping candles burning at holy altars. Delaunay traced similarities between the Pahlavi descriptions of temple architecture and certain early medieval monasteries in Gaul and Italy. The layout, the circular courtyards, even the central focus on light and symmetry seemed too familiar to be coincidence. When he tried to publish his findings in 1911, his paper was rejected by major historical journals, and shortly after, his notes vanished from the archives of the French Academy. Only copies of his translations survived, quietly preserved in private collections. One fragment from those letters reads, "If our temples fall, the fire shall travel. It will find new walls, and there it will teach them that light cannot be conquered." Perhaps the priests of Tabaristan succeeded. Perhaps the eternal fire they carried still burns somewhere far from its homeland, buried under layers of faith that forgot its origin. What began as a desperate flight from destruction may have become the hidden bridge between two worlds, Persia and Christendom, the old and the new. And if those letters are true, then the story of the sacred fire did not end with exile. It transformed, finding a new home beneath the very altars that later claimed to have brought light to the world. In the autumn of 1874, a historian named Charles Beaumont arrived in Rome with a letter of recommendation from the University of Oxford and a lifelong obsession with the early encounters between Persia and Christendom. His goal was simple, or so he thought. He wished to consult a collection of documents rumoured to exist within the Vatican's secret archive, a set known among a few scholars as the Acta Persica. These were said to contain reports, letters, and translations relating to Zoroastrian communities that once existed in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. Beaumont, fluent in Latin and Pahlavi, was granted rare permission to enter the archive after weeks of petitioning. The rules were strict. He would be escorted by a Vatican librarian. He could request only 4 documents per day, and nothing could leave the room. The first 3 documents were fascinating, but relatively harmless. Diplomatic correspondence between early popes and Eastern bishops. A translation of a Persian astronomical chart. and a record of confiscated artifacts labelled pagan. But it was the fourth item on his list that drew his greatest curiosity. It was titled European Atash Bahrams, a phrase that made the archivists uneasy the moment he spoke it. Atash Bahrams were the highest order of Zoroastrian fire temples, places where a sacred flame was tended without interruption. According to rumour, one such temple had once existed beneath a medieval monastery in southern France. Beaumont's request to see the file was denied without explanation. The librarian simply closed the ledger and said, "That document does not exist for you." When Beaumont pressed for clarification, the man only repeated the phrase. Later that evening, while taking notes in his lodging near the Piazza Navona, Beaumont wrote in his journal that the refusal felt rehearsed, as if the archivist had been instructed long before he arrived. He noted the strange reaction in the librarian's eyes, a flicker of fear, not anger. Over the next few days, he returned to the archive, hoping the rules had softened. Each time he asked about the missing document, he was told it had been removed for preservation, then that it was undergoing translation, and finally that it had never existed at all. Yet, on the official catalogue sheet, Item 4 still bore the title, clearly written in the same ink as the others. Years later, when Beaumont published his study on Eastern influences in medieval Christianity, he made only a passing reference to the encounter. But in a private letter to a colleague, he described his conviction that the Vatican possessed undeniable evidence of Zoroastrian fire altars found beneath European churches. "They hide it," he wrote, "not because it would destroy faith, but because it would prove that the light they claim to guard was never theirs to begin with." After his death in 1881, his journals vanished from his estate, leaving only fragments quoted in secondary sources. The librarian's refusal became legend, a quiet reminder that sometimes the truth is not destroyed. It is simply denied access. In the spring of 1562, a parchment-bound manual was seized from a Benedictine abbey near Marseille. The document bore no title, only the symbol of a flame enclosed within a circle of 12 stars. When Vatican officials catalogued it, they described it as a treatise of natural superstition, yet its contents told another story. Within its pages were detailed recipes for sacred lamp oils blended from olive, sesame, and cedar resin, proportions of mineral salts mixed with powdered quartz, and precise instructions for lighting rituals timed to the rising of two specific stars, Aldebaran and Regulus. Each mixture was said to purify the air, to stabilize the flame, and to align the mind with what the unknown author called the divine rhythm of the heavens. The language of the text, a strange fusion of Latin and Middle Persian transliterations, confused the examiners. Certain words like atar, denoting fire, and Asha, meaning order, hinted at an origin far older than the monastery itself. Some phrases appeared nearly identical to invocations found in Zoroastrian ritual manuals. The monks claimed the manuscript had been in their library for generations, passed down from an earlier abbey destroyed during a raid in the 9th century. The Vatican ordered the book confiscated and sealed. Officially, it disappeared. Unofficially, its ideas survived. 2 centuries later, similar formulas began reappearing in cloistered studies across Europe, disguised as experiments in what scholars then called natural philosophy. Alchemists mixed oils and salts to sustain clean flames for long nights of observation. Monks who studied the stars recorded their findings beside notes on prayer and purification. In hidden circles, whispers spread that certain constellations could enhance the clarity of the human mind. Aldebaran, the red eye of Taurus, and Regulus, the heart of Leo, were seen as twin gates of fire, marking the balance between matter and spirit. To ignite a lamp at the moment these stars rose above the horizon was believed to invite illumination in its purest form. The Church tolerated astronomy, but it feared any link between stars and spirit. The confiscated manual was quietly cited in later prohibitions against mixing ritual with observation. Yet, its influence persisted in coded form, woven into the studies of early scientists like Paracelsus and Tycho Brahe, who both wrote of heavenly fire and mineral salt as reflections of divine design. By the 18th century, the original text had faded from history, but its formulas lived on in laboratories and cathedrals alike. Even today, when chemists analyze ancient oils used in temple lamps, they find traces of the same blend once described in that forbidden manuscript. It seems knowledge, like fire, cannot be fully extinguished. It only changes hands, waiting for the next generation to recognize its light. And perhaps, somewhere deep within the archives, that nameless manual still rests, its ink faded, its symbols misunderstood, holding within its fragile pages the recipe not for alchemy or sorcery, but for the forgotten art of aligning light with truth. Every spring, as the night before Easter falls upon the Christian world, churches across Europe darken their halls and extinguish every light. Then, at the stroke of midnight, a single flame is lit. It is called the Holy Fire, said to descend miraculously from heaven to relight the Paschal candle, symbolizing Christ's resurrection. The ritual is ancient, solemn, and radiant. Yet beneath its beauty lies a question that few have dared to ask. Where did this practice begin? The earliest record of a vigil flame predates Christianity itself, found not in Rome, but in the rituals of Zoroastrian Persia. For centuries, before the birth of Christ, Persian priests marked the renewal of the year through purification cycles tied to the movement of the Sunday. These rituals reached their height during Nowruz, the new year celebrated at the spring equinox. Fires were extinguished across cities and temples, and after moments of darkness, a sacred flame was rekindled from pure sources of light, often sunlight refracted through polished metal mirrors. The act symbolized the cleansing of creation and the triumph of order over decay. The faithful gathered around the rekindled flame, believing its light would restore harmony to both soul and cosmos. When Christianity spread through lands once touched by Persian influence, the imagery of light and rebirth was too powerful to ignore. Early missionaries, seeking to bridge the gap between pagan and Christian faiths, adapted the ritual. The Easter Vigil became a baptism not only of believers, but of the flame itself. What had once been the fire of creation was reborn as the light of salvation. The Zoroastrian priests had called it Attar, the purest expression of divine truth. The Church renamed it Lux Christi, the light of Christ. In both traditions, fire marked the boundary between death and renewal. But there was a difference. In Zoroastrianism, the flame was eternal and self-sustaining, requiring no miracle to exist. In the Christian version, it became dependent on divine intervention. The light was no longer humanity's shared inheritance, but a gift granted by heaven through the Church's hand. Over centuries, the ceremony grew more theatrical. In Jerusalem, pilgrims now gather each year in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to witness the descent of the Holy Fire, believing it to appear spontaneously from the tomb. Few realize that the ritual structure mirrors the Persian purification cycles almost exactly, from the extinguishing of the old flame to the timing of its return at the spring equinox. The Church baptized the fire, claiming its origin, yet its essence remained unchanged. It still purifies, renews, and reminds the faithful that darkness is never final. The line between inspiration and appropriation blurs like smoke. Perhaps the question is not who invented the flame, but who has the right to name its light, for in the end, fire belongs to no one. It was burning long before faith had a name, and it will continue to burn long after names have turned to ash. In the early years of the 20th century, long before satellite imaging or digital archives, archaeology was an act of faith. Teams of explorers roamed the hills of Armenia and Anatolia, searching for the buried traces of empires older than memory itself. Among their journals, a pattern begins to appear. Reports of sealed chambers discovered beneath churches, perfectly cut entryways, leading into spaces that no one had expected to find. At first glance, these field notes seem routine, measurements, sketches, brief descriptions. But then, the entries stop mid-sentence, pages torn or blacked out, replaced with stamped seals reading privatum. The word meant private, but to those who worked in the field, it meant forbidden. In 1910, an expedition led by Father Lucien Morel uncovered what he described as a subterranean room under a crumbling basilica near Lake Van. Inside were traces of soot, blackened stones arranged in concentric circles, and fragments of metal bowls fused by extreme heat. The configuration matched no known Christian design. Morel's notes mention an unusual scent, like resin or cedar oil. His team photographed everything, yet when his findings were submitted to the Catholic Archaeological Commission in Rome, only the written summary survived. The photographs were never published. 5 years later, another team, excavating in Cappadocia, encountered a similar chamber beneath a rock-hewn monastery. The space was lined with smooth basalt, and at its centre stood a pit filled with hardened ash. The local villagers called it the place of the old fire. The lead archaeologist, Professor Otto Hartmann, documented every detail until the final days of the dig, when Vatican representatives arrived unexpectedly. Within a week, all excavation ceased. Hartmann's report was archived under restricted classification. The official explanation claimed structural instability, yet his assistant later wrote in a private letter that the chamber had been sealed deliberately with new mortar before the team departed. Over the next decades, such silences multiplied. Every mention of subterranean fire basins beneath Christian sites was quietly removed from public records. In some cases, references vanished entirely from published works, leaving behind page gaps and citations that led nowhere. The few surviving fragments describe these spaces with unsettling consistency. They were circular, often aligned with cardinal directions, and contained residues of burned metals similar to those used in Zoroastrian rituals. Some even bore inscriptions in early Pahlavi script etched into the walls, faint but unmistakable. The official reports reduced these findings to natural formations or pre-Christian storage pits. Yet for those who had seen them, the truth was harder to dismiss. Beneath the surface of medieval Christendom, remnants of an older faith were still smouldering, their light buried but unextinguished. Archaeology, meant to reveal the past, had become its keeper of silence. Perhaps the real story of these chambers lies not in the soil of Armenia or Anatolia, but in the vaults of institutions that decided humanity was not ready to know what burned before the cross. In the ancient Zoroastrian world, cleanliness was not vanity, it was devotion. Every act of purification, from washing the hands to changing a garment, was seen as a battle between truth and decay. The Avesta, their sacred scripture, devoted entire sections to the laws of purity. Water was the breath of creation, fire its heart, and the human body the vessel that had to remain worthy of both. Priests washed before tending the sacred flame, changed their linen garments daily, and avoided contact with death and corruption. Cleanliness was the reflection of divine order. Centuries later, in the monasteries of medieval Europe, similar rituals began to appear, though wrapped in Christian language. Monks rose before dawn to wash in cold water, not for comfort but for humility. Their robes were to be simple, unstained, and worn only after ritual cleansing. Ash was used in blessings and confessions. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, required that monks maintain purity in both body and spirit, that their cells remain free from dirt, and that hands be washed before meals and prayer. To most, these practices seemed purely Christian, but when compared with the priestly codes of the Avesta, the resemblance becomes impossible to ignore. Both traditions viewed impurity not as physical dirt, but as a spiritual infection that spread through disorder. Both treated water and fire as sacred tools for restoring balance, and both regarded garments as extensions of the soul, symbolic skins that should remain untainted. The Zoroastrian priesthood had worn white robes to mirror purity, tied with a sacred cord called the kusti, a physical reminder to walk in truth. In certain monastic orders, a similar belt appeared, called the cincture, worn by monks when reciting vows. Historians describe these parallels as coincidence, yet no one explains how a religion born in ancient Persia and a church rising in medieval Europe came to share identical codes of purity. There were differences too, and they reveal a struggle. Where Zoroastrianism celebrated cleanliness as sacred alignment with creation, the medieval church began to twist it into denial. Asceticism replaced harmony. Dirt became proof of holiness. Some monks refused to wash for years, believing that suffering made them closer to God. The body, once honoured as a temple, became treated as a prison. Still, the traces of the older wisdom lingered. Within the cloisters, novices were taught that water restored the spirit, that light cleansed the mind, that silence purified thought. Even when they no longer knew the names of Ahura Mazda or Asha, they were still following laws written centuries before their faith began. Perhaps the heresy was not in cleanliness itself, but in forgetting where it came from. Beneath the dust of medieval austerity lies a memory of a time when purity was not rejection of the body, but reverence for it. When washing was not a sin of pride, but an act of gratitude. And when to be clean was simply to be aligned with truth, as fire, water, and the soul had always intended. In the summer of 1683, a Jesuit missionary named Father Matteo di Rossi set out from Venice on a journey that would take him farther east than any of his order had gone before. His official mission was to gather information on the religious practices of Persia for the Congregation of the Propagation of the Faith. Unofficially, his orders were more delicate. He was to locate the ancient fire temple of Yazd, a sanctuary said to contain one of the last living flames of Zoroastrianism. Few Christians had ever seen it. The diary he kept throughout his travels survives only in fragments, preserved in the archives of Lisbon. The entries begin with the tone of a curious scholar. He writes of his fascination with Persian architecture, the fragrance of burning sandalwood, and the dignity of the white-robed priests who tended the fires in small village shrines along the way. He calls them remnants of Babel, noble yet misguided. But as he approaches Yazd, something begins to change in his words. The judgment fades. In one entry, dated the 15th of July, he describes standing on a hill at dusk, watching a faint glow rise from the distant city. He writes, "It is not like any fire I have known. It does not dance, it breathes." When he finally arrives at the temple, he records the details with trembling reverence. The chamber is circular, built of pale stone, polished by centuries of heat. In its centre, on a bronze altar, burns a flame so pure it emits no smoke. Around it, priests chant in a tongue older than Latin, their voices blending with the hum of the fire itself. Father Matteo notes that the room feels alive, as if the air were charged with thought. He writes that he expected to feel the urge to extinguish the flame in the name of Christ, but instead felt compelled to kneel. "I came to study them," he writes, "but it is they who are studying me." His tone shifts from theological curiosity to quiet awe. He begins comparing the Zoroastrian light to the divine fire of Pentecost, suggesting that perhaps the same spirit moves through both. Could it be, he wonders, that truth was never lost, only divided by language? His last complete entry describes a conversation with the high priest, who tells him, "The fire needs no defender, it remembers who tends it." After that, the diary breaks. The remaining pages are torn cleanly from the binding. When the diary resurfaced in Europe decades later, the missing section was said to contain a confession too dangerous to print. Some claim Father Matteo abandoned his mission and remained in Persia. Others say he returned to Rome only to vanish into silence. What is certain is that a Jesuit once stood before the sacred fire of Yazd and saw not a heresy, but a reflection. A flame that crossed faiths, centuries, and empires, burning for no one, yet belonging to all who could still recognize its light. In the late 16th century, travellers and chroniclers whispered of a strange stone held within a private collection in Rome. It was called the Altar Without Shadow, a title that drew curiosity and fear in equal measure. According to the accounts, whenever the stone was placed near a consecrated flame, no shadow fell across the floor. The priests who observed it claimed the light seemed to bend around the stone, as if the fire itself respected its surface. No sketches survive, only descriptions written in hurried Latin notes, often smudged or crossed out. Scholars of the time attempted to explain the phenomenon, calling it miracle, trick of the light, or divine intervention. Yet, modern researchers analysing similar accounts have suggested something more mundane yet remarkable. The stone was likely a polished slab of quartz or another high albedo material, capable of reflecting and scattering light in ways that made shadows vanish when flames were nearby. The effect would have been startling to those unfamiliar with optics. In Persia, similar stones were used in fire temples to amplify the radiance of sacred flames, creating the impression that fire was alive and boundless. When Christianity spread into regions touched by Zoroastrian influence, it appears that certain ritual objects were absorbed, often without context. The altar without shadow may have been one such artifact, preserved in secrecy because its power challenged the simplicity of ordinary light. The earliest mention in European manuscripts comes from an Italian priest writing in 1594. He notes that the stone was acquired from a traveller who had visited a distant monastery in Anatolia. The priest describes the awe it inspired among monks, their reluctance to touch it, and the hushed reverence with which they cleaned and polished it. By the 17th century, the stone's location had shifted, likely moved into the private vaults of a cardinal who sought to study it without drawing attention. When modern historians attempt to trace its path, the trail ends abruptly. Some speculate that it was hidden in the Vatican's secret archive. Others believe it was lost or deliberately destroyed to prevent questions from spreading. Regardless of its fate, the legend persisted. Writers and travellers in France, Spain, and Germany recounted seeing similar effects in ritual chambers, where flames seemed to float, shadows refused to settle, and the faithful were moved to wonder. What did it mean? Was it divine favour, an optical marvel, or evidence of a science older than Christianity itself? The stone's absence only deepened the mystery. The altar without shadow reminds us that light, like knowledge, can be controlled, amplified, or hidden. Those who once possessed it understood its power. They knew that when fire and reflection meet, ordinary perception is suspended. Perhaps that is why it vanished. Some things are too potent to remain in the open, too revealing to allow the ordinary world to see. And so, the stone, like the flame it was meant to honour, waits somewhere beyond our gaze, a silent witness to a time when light itself was considered sacred and uncontainable. In the workshops of medieval Europe, the clang of hammer on anvil was more than labour. It was ritual. Guilds of blacksmiths, goldsmiths, and metalworkers passed down secret techniques, some whispered to have been taught by a mysterious figure they called the Angel of Fire. No one knew where this angel came from, only that it appeared in legends as a guide, instructing apprentices in the tempering of steel, the casting of bronze, and the creation of intricate filigree. Written accounts from the 15th century describe the angel as a radiant figure, often appearing at twilight, illuminating the forge with a light that seemed neither candle nor flame. To the faithful, it was a saint, sent from heaven to bless the craft. Yet when scholars cross-read these guild texts with ancient Persian scriptures, a startling pattern emerges. The attributes of the Angel of Fire match closely the descriptions of Saoshyant, the Zoroastrian archangel of obedience and cosmic order, and Attar, the divine fire itself. In the Avesta, Saoshyant guides mortals in righteous action, protects the sacred flame, and mediates between the heavens and the earthly realm. Atar is the element that fuels life, illuminates truth, and purifies the soul. The European legends, it seems, are not purely Christian inventions, but translations of older divine functions, masked to fit the language of saints and angels. Guild initiates may have understood this. The rituals surrounding the forge, smoke wafted toward the heavens, ashes collected and preserved, fire kindled only at sacred times, mirror Zoroastrian ceremonial precision. Even the symbols engraved on tools and anvils reflect star patterns and geometric ratios found in Persian fire temples. By invoking an angel, European metalworkers could preserve the older knowledge without attracting theological scrutiny. The Church tolerated devotion to saints, but knowledge tied directly to pre-Christian practices was dangerous. The angel's teachings ensured that the flame of creation continued to inform human craft while being cloaked in acceptable narrative. Letters from guild masters describe apprentices learning to control heat, timing, and material, with a level of skill that seems almost mystical. They speak of processes that survive centuries unchanged, techniques that could not have been invented independently in Europe at the time. This hidden inheritance suggests a continuity of understanding, a secret chain linking the forges of Yazd and Persepolis to the workshops of Florence and Nuremberg. Even today, when a blade is struck and bends perfectly, when bronze filigree holds without flaw, it is possible to see the shadow of that angelic figure. Not a celestial being in the literal sense, but the echo of Saoshyant and Atar preserved through centuries. The forge itself becomes sacred, the metal sacred, and the act of creation, a living homage to a fire older than Christendom, a reminder that knowledge, once born, cannot be extinguished entirely, even if it must hide behind saints and angels. In the hidden vaults of European cathedrals and private collections, there exist relics that defy explanation. Scholars refer to them only in hushed tones, because to speak too openly is to invite scrutiny or dismissal. Among these are charred reliquaries that never fully cool, as if the fire that consumed them continues to burn beneath the surface. They appear blackened and scorched, yet touch reveals no heat and smoke refuses to rise. Some believe these objects were consecrated in secret ceremonies, their fires stoked by oils and resins described in manuscripts that vanished centuries ago. Alongside them, sootless lamp bowls have been discovered. These bowls, often bronze or clay, show no sign of combustion despite centuries of use in monastic observances. The residue that should mark every hour of burning is absent. When chemical analysis is attempted, the traces of ancient oils remain intact, their composition consistent with substances imported from Persia in the early medieval period. Perhaps most remarkable are the fragments of bronze braziers, their surfaces etched with intricate motifs, identical to those in Zoroastrian fire temples. The patterns depict flames that rise like serpents, geometric stars, and stylized representations of Atar and Saoshyant. In some cases, the iconography even matches diagrams found in early Pahlavi texts describing purification rituals and cosmic alignment. None of these objects are displayed to the public. They are catalogued meticulously, each assigned a reference number, each entry marked privatum. When researchers request access, explanations are vague, referencing preservation, security, or the potential for scandal. The objects sit in silence, the only witnesses to their existence being archivists and a select few scholars who understand their significance. Records suggest that certain bishops and cardinals were involved in moving these relics into deeper vaults during the 15th and 16th centuries, after fears arose that knowledge of their origin would undermine official narratives of faith. Over time, their history became layered with myth. Some claim the charred reliquaries are blessed with divine protection. Others suggest that they are conduits of a hidden science, capable of preserving heat and energy far beyond natural limits. In truth, the fragments offer no answers, only questions. They hint at continuity, a thread of ritual knowledge that survived conquest, reform, and suppression. For those who study them, the message is clear. The sacred fire of the Zoroastrians, the eternal flame carried westward by priests fleeing invasion, did not vanish. It was absorbed, hidden, and transformed. Its essence lingers in metal, ceramic, and ash, waiting to be understood. The relics of heat remind us that the past is never truly extinguished. It may be buried, obscured, or catalogued away in secret archives, yet its presence continues to influence the world, a silent testament to a flame that refuses to die. In the shadowed corridors of the Vatican's secret archive, there exists a document that few have ever glimpsed. It is referred to by scholars in whispers as the Index of Extinguished Fires. The list details the systematic closure of non-Christian flame shrines across Europe, spanning centuries from the 9th to the 15th. Each entry records the site's name, the date it was sealed, the custodian who oversaw the transition, and the texts absorbed or destroyed in the process. It is a ledger of control, a map of extinguished light. One entry, dated the 23rd of March, 987, notes a small temple in northern Gaul where the sacred flame had been tended for generations. The custodian, a local priest who had secretly preserved the ritual, was bribed with land and exemption from tithes. The flame was transferred to a hidden brazier, and the manuscripts describing its origin were copied into Latin and stored under lock, never to see public use. Another entry from the 15th of July, 1231, describes a shrine in the hills of Tuscany. The Zoroastrian flame there was declared heretical, its oils confiscated, and the ritual renamed as the Easter Vigil. The original formulas for purification were annotated in Latin margins, interpreted through a Christian lens, and placed into monastic libraries where few could read them. The index also notes how families, communities, and even entire villages were persuaded to adopt new practices, sometimes through gifts, sometimes through threats, and occasionally through subtle instruction. Over centuries, these actions created a quiet uniformity. The sacred fires of Persia, once scattered across Europe by fleeing priests, were either absorbed into Christian practice or erased entirely. The index itself is more than a record. It is a roadmap of cultural transformation, a testament to the power of institutional memory. Every site sealed represents knowledge lost to the public. Every text absorbed represents a lineage of learning redirected. Scholars who have studied surviving fragments of the index have noted patterns that suggest intention beyond mere preservation. The selection of sites, the timing of closures, and the alignment of the extinguished flames with ecclesiastical calendars indicate a strategy to consolidate not only spiritual authority, but also control over temporal knowledge. Even today, archaeologists encounter remnants of these suppressed fires beneath churches and monasteries. Charred stones, sootless lamps, and sealed cavities hint at the existence of what was once celebrated openly. Yet, the index ensures that few understand the scale of what was lost. Knowledge, ritual, and history were edited quietly, systematically, without the need for open conflict. It was a slow extinguishing, a rewriting of memory. The flames themselves, though buried, continue to burn in fragments. Scholars who trace their paths recognize the thread that links temples in Gaul to monastic fires in Italy, all catalogued in a document that remains hidden from the public eye. The Index of Extinguished Fires is proof that light can be controlled, not by destruction alone, but by careful, patient secrecy, and that the history of a 1,000-year-old flame may be written in the quiet absence it leaves behind. By the 15th century, Europe was awakening from the long shadow of medieval rule. Artists, scholars, and architects looked to the past for inspiration, claiming to rediscover the wisdom of Greece and Rome. Yet, Beneath this surface, a subtler process was at work. The Church, still the keeper of Europe's largest archives, selectively released fragments of knowledge from the East. Ancient manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, and ritual reached Florence, Venice, and Paris, carefully timed to enhance the Church's image as a cultured, enlightened institution. Among these were texts that hinted at Zoroastrian practices, fire rituals, purification laws, and star alignments. They were presented as curiosities, exotic insights into distant lands, rather than the legacy of an older science that had shaped Western civilization long before Christendom fully consolidated. Scholars who received these documents marveled at their sophistication. They reconstructed architectural patterns, calculated celestial charts, and experimented with lamp oils, yet they were given only part of the puzzle. Critical elements were withheld, including detailed instructions for tending sacred flames, complete purification cycles, and the full philosophical context of Asha, the principle of truth and order. The Church controlled not only what was seen, but how it was interpreted. The release was never accidental. When Lorenzo de' Medici founded libraries and academies in Florence, manuscripts arrived in batches corresponding to key political and cultural moments. Knowledge arrived precisely when it could enhance prestige, inspire loyalty, or cement the Church's claim to being the conduit of all learning. It was as if a fire had been kindled behind closed doors, and only selected sparks were allowed to escape into the world. Artists painted luminous altars, and scholars wrote treatises on geometry, without understanding that their inspiration was drawn from a flame whose source they were never permitted to see. When Copernicus studied planetary motion or Leonardo sketched mechanisms of flight, some of the mathematical and astronomical concepts they accessed had roots in texts that originated in Persia, preserved and transported under the watchful eye of Catholic custodians. Yet, the broader framework of that knowledge, the spiritual, ethical, and ritual dimensions, remained hidden. The Church curated enlightenment. It was a controlled release designed to illuminate the public while keeping the power of the full flame reserved for itself. In this way, the Renaissance was not a spontaneous rebirth of European genius, but a carefully staged performance. Civilization appeared to awaken, but the light had always burned, quietly and invisibly, in the vaults beneath Rome, behind doors marked privatum. Those who held the keys decided which sparks to release and which to contain. Scholars, artists, and philosophers believed they were discovering, yet they were often following a path laid centuries earlier by priests who understood the true nature of fire, of light, and of human perception. The story of this selective awakening challenges the narrative of the Renaissance as a purely organic flowering. It suggests that the brilliance of the era was shaped not only by curiosity, but by discretion. Flame without fire, knowledge without context, wisdom released in fragments. And through it all, the Church remained the silent guardian of the greater illumination, the eternal light it alone could claim to possess. Fire has always been more than light. In the teachings of Zoroastrianism, it is living conscience, an active force that responds to the purity of the soul. It judges, illuminates, and transforms. When a priest tends the sacred flame, the act is not ceremonial alone, it is ethical. Each flicker reflects a choice, each steady glow affirms alignment with Asha, the principle of truth and cosmic order. The fire consumes deception, purifies intention, and reminds the faithful that moral action is inseparable from awareness. Contrast this with the institutional light of medieval Europe. Candles in cathedrals burn in perfection, arranged along altars and niches. They illuminate space, decorate rituals, and inspire awe. Yet they rarely teach discernment. Their glow is spectacle, meant to impress, to convey authority. The light is controlled, predictable, and insulated from moral consequence. One observes, but the flame does not respond. When truth is treated as heat, it changes people. The heat compels engagement. It presses against the soul, warming what is righteous, burning what is false. In Persia, Zoroastrian priests understood that fire is not passive. It holds memory. It records transgression. A priest approaching the altar does so knowing the flame is witness, teacher, and guide. The ethical dimension is active. One's conscience is engaged, tested, and refined. When truth is reduced to glow, the lesson changes. Light can be admired, collected, or controlled. It can decorate ceilings or highlight stained glass. It creates wonder, but rarely transformation. In European monasteries, illumination serves doctrine. The faithful are instructed, yet the fire cannot discern sincerity. It shines evenly on the obedient and the deceitful alike. Ethics are prescribed externally rather than experienced internally. History is full of examples where the difference mattered. The Zoroastrian fire, tended continuously for centuries, survived conquest and exile because it was revered not for appearance but for essence. In contrast, many Western lamps and vigil candles were extinguished, replaced, or repurposed. Their symbolic light remained, but its power to transform the observer diminished. Philosophers of the Enlightenment recognized this distinction. They argued that knowledge, like fire, must be active. It must provoke, challenge, and change. A glow can comfort, but heat compels. The ethical lesson of light is not in seeing, but in feeling. When the Church selectively released knowledge from Eastern sources, it offered glow without heat. Scholars could observe, copy, and admire, but the moral and transformative power embedded in the original flame was obscured. The question persists today. How does one distinguish spectacle from conscience, admiration from engagement, light from fire? In the end, the distinction is not technical, it is ethical. A flame that burns in response to truth teaches responsibility. A glow that illuminates only for effect teaches obedience. Zoroastrian fire endures because it is heat, alive and demanding. Institutional light endures because it is controlled, comforting, and obedient. The difference shapes civilizations, guides societies, and determines whether humanity is merely dazzled or truly transformed. The story begins and ends with a flame. Hidden beneath centuries of stone and scripture, it waits quietly, patient and unjudging. If the Vatican holds proof of pre-Christian fire cults beneath Christian sites, that knowledge has been locked away for generations. It has been catalogued, sealed, and whispered about only in private journals, archives, and the careful notes of scholars who were allowed to glimpse but never touch its full truth. Yet, the flame itself, like history, does not disappear because it is unseen. It persists, preserved in ash, stone, and ritual memory, a reminder that human understanding is often more fragile than the forces it seeks to control. Releasing that knowledge would not destroy faith. It could refine it, deepen it, and reconnect believers to a continuity of wisdom that predates the Church, yet flows naturally into it. Imagine learning that the eternal light of Zoroastrianism, once carried west by fleeing priests, continues to burn quietly beneath altars, that its principles of truth, order, and conscience have influenced rituals, architecture, and the very moral codes of Europe. It does not negate Christian teaching. It illuminates the roots of reverence, the shared human desire to honor light and life. For centuries, the Church has held the key to this secret, and in its hands, power has remained unquestioned. But every locked vault contains not only absence, but possibility. Scholars who study the traces, the charred reliquaries that never cool, the sootless lamps, the fragments of braziers etched with Eastern motifs, understand that the flame's history is also our history. It reminds us that knowledge can be preserved without destruction, that reverence can be maintained without fear, and that the past need not be rewritten, only acknowledged. To open the hearth, to allow the flame air once more, is to honor both truth and faith simultaneously. It is not rebellion, it is recognition. Every flame tells a story, every ritual preserves a memory. Every document, every artifact is a spark waiting to illuminate what has been hidden. The Vatican has kept these sparks confined for centuries, but containment is not proof of danger. It is proof of understanding that what is powerful requires care. The question is whether humanity is ready to accept that care without fear. In releasing the evidence of pre-Christian fire cults, a door opens not to chaos, but to perspective. Faith is strengthened when it is not the only source of light. Knowledge and devotion can coexist, burn side by side, and shape minds capable of both wonder and reason. The flame, patient as it is, does not demand immediate recognition. It asks only for acknowledgement. The story ends where it began, in a vault behind locked doors, waiting for the hand bold enough to open it, and for the air to breathe life into a fire that has already endured. It reminds us that light is not conquered by concealment, that truth cannot be extinguished by silence, and that sometimes the most profound power lies not in holding the flame, but in sharing it. To open the hearth is to see history clearly, to honor continuity, and to let fire, at last, illuminate the path ahead.